Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for this National Ecosystem Services Partnership webinar. We are going to be hearing from Greg Frey of the U.S. Forest Service in just a moment. He'll be talking about payments for forest-based ecosystem services from private lands in the United States. Before we kick that off, just want to let you know I'm Lydia Olander from the Nicholas Institute at Duke University, and along with Sarah Mason, we'll be hosting this webinar for you, and we'll have just a few quick announcements before we get going. So first, just a couple updates. So we have a journal article recently published on the use of ecosystem services conceptual models to account for benefits of public lands. It was an example from on national forest planning with the Ashley Forest in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service. So that might be of interest to some folks on this call. So there's a link for that I will put in the link into the chat as soon as we're done presenting here. And we also, there's a special issue on ecosystem services in natural capital accounting that is being slowly populated by a community of federal agency folks and other experts in partnership with the USGS. And there are papers already in there on ecosystem accounts in the southeastern US, on land accounts, water accounts, and urban ecosystem accounts that might also be of interest to this community. And then I wanted to note that we've had some recent webinars that might be of interest to folks that are now posted online. So we had a wonderful presentation by Bonnie Keeler from the University of Minnesota about different ways to do valuation and the implications of those different approaches of valuation that I thought was fantastic. So if you didn't get to see that, that's online now. We also have a webinar where we presented results of work we've been doing in the Gulf of Mexico on ecosystem services and socioeconomic monitoring for coastal restoration. That is also available. Next slide, please. Right, so just quickly want to introduce Gregory Frey. So he's been a researcher, research forester at the USDA Forest Service since 2014. And he works on empowering landowners to use their lives in a way that also benefits society. So he's involved, evaluates forest policies, programs, regulations, and taxes on forests and people. Previously served as an environmental educator with the Peace Corps in Paraguay, and has had positions at the World Bank helping countries fight deforestation with programs of with reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, and also at Virginia State University. He has a PhD in forestry with a minor in economics, and is from North Carolina State University, so not down the road from where we sit right now. All right, so I'm going to turn this over to Greg, and he can share his slides and jump into his presentation. Thank you for joining us, Greg. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Lydia. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation. Hopefully you can see my slides now.
I can see them, but they're not yet in presentation mode. There they are. That's good.
Okay. So thank you for that introduction. This, like I said, it's an honor to be here, and thank everyone for coming. I'm going to speak to you today about an initiative to kind of account for various forms of paying forest landowners for the ecosystem services they provide, as comprehensive as we possibly could. I want to thank my co-authors here, especially Chalisa Kalyana Mitra, who did a lot of the, and Deli Wilkins, who did a lot of the data gathering. Chalisa did an internship with me last summer, and while she was at Carnegie Mellon University, now she is doing a short stint at the World Bank. Will be back to the Bank of Thailand soon, and Deli Wilkins is working now for the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, and Natasha James, who used to be my colleague at the Southern Research Station, but now is working for the Forest Service in a different capacity in the Strategic Planning and Budget Office. But thanks to them for helping put all this data together. It's really not a deeply complex theoretical exercise. It's more about data collection and compilation, which you will see. So why did we do this? Well, we know that private lands are the majority of forests in the United States, and about almost 3/5. But in some states, it's much higher, like almost 90% in a lot of the southern and northeastern states. And these private forests provide a lot of the ecosystem services that our society depends on. And without any form of economic compensation for providing these services, economic theory tells us that they will provide less than they would provide if they were compensated. So this will lead to a suboptimal level of ecosystem services overall in our nation. So just to briefly cover the economic theory, I know there's probably a lot of folks here who are not economists, but economists have thought about this question for a while, and it's what we call an externality in economic jargon. But Arthur Cecil Pigot suggested that a system of taxes and subsidies could be used to kind of compensate landowner or providers of positive externalities and penalize producers of negative externalities and achieve the optimal level. Later, Ronald Coase reformulated this as more of a property rights issue and said that as long as the property rights of these externalities are well defined, who's responsible for them, and then society, through negotiation between actors, will allow for payments to either cease certain negative externalities or payments to provide more of positive externalities, and by that way reach the economic optimum. But this depends, again, on making sure that the rights of people and entities are well defined. By the way, both of these economists are British and kind of formulated a lot of environmental economic thinking on about externalities and how to deal with them. Although Ronald Coase did end up in the University of Chicago. So how does that play out in our modern world? Well, we're all familiar with this term, payments for ecosystem services or payments for environmental services. And the idea of this came about due to Ronald Coase's work. And the idea at its outset was about people paying other people, or companies paying other companies, probably more likely to do things just based on what is what their property rights are. But over time, this payment for ecosystem service framework began to incorporate more other types of payments, including more like subsidies that you would find from a Pigovian approach, and also hybrid examples of payments that include both market mechanisms and subsidy mechanisms. So Lydia mentioned a few initiatives that I want to just clarify that those are really important things to do to do the natural capital accounting is really crucial and important work, as well as the valuation of ecosystem services from an economic standpoint. And those are really important things to do and extremely challenging. But a lot of these things are still remain unknown, which is why that work is really important. At the same time, we have a lot of markets and programs that are already existing and money and transactions already happening, even without knowing exactly what the economic value of those services are, or what the exact quantity of water quality or carbon that is being captured or produced is. And so it's important to have a baseline of, what is the dollars that are actually being traded on this market, even though we may not know exactly yet what the exact quantity of ecosystem services being produced or value of those ecosystem services is. So our goal was to account for the dollars that are actually being traded or being passed from one person to another, from one entity to another, and document those payments to the fullest extent possible so that we know how much money is flowing to private forest landowners to compensate them for ecosystem services. And we want to really understand what these programs and markets and policies are, who they're going to, and how big are they, how much is being traded, and what are the trends over time and over space for these programs and markets. So what did we do? Well, first, we set about thinking about what are the kinds of mechanisms by which a forest landowner might receive a payment for an ecosystem service. And well, we have public payments, so a payment from a government entity or agency to a private forest landowner. We have compliance transactions, which are markets that form to respond to regulatory frameworks that are mandated by the government, and voluntary transactions, which are purely for someone's good nature or social corporate responsibility, without needing any prompting by government regulation. So we had to sort of create some criteria for what we're going to include and what we're not going to include. What makes something a payment for ecosystem services? So these were the criteria we came up with. First of all, the compensation has to be direct and monetary in nature, so not like technical assistance or something along those lines. It had to be direct and monetary, had to be related to private land, had to be related to trees, forests, or forestry. That was just our the scope of what we were looking at, not that there aren't ecosystem services that come from non-forest areas. The payment has to be in response to having the private landowner do something or refrain from doing something, or to allow access to forests. So to do something such as some kind of forest management that will help produce more services, or to refrain from doing something such as cutting down trees and putting up a Walmart, or to allow access overall, such as for hunting. We only included the amount that was paid by one entity to the landowner, so not whatever amount that the landowner itself may have to contribute into that pot to do. So if there's like a cost sharing program, you might get 50-50 from the government and landowner, but we're not including the 50 that comes from the landowner. And these have to be either explicitly or at least implicitly justified by some type of forest-based ecosystem service. So what are those ecosystem services? We grouped these as best we could. And there's really three main ones that we found, and then kind of a catch-all for the rest. The first is carbon sequestration and storage, water quality and watershed protection, biodiversity habitat, and then the catch-all for things that weren't clearly defined was what we called bundle services. So this might be like a conservation easement that you're clearly conserving the forest land because it's providing ecosystem services, but it's not clear which ecosystem service, or whether it's you just want to provide that whole suite of forest-based ecosystem services. So we got data from administrative data of government programs, public registries for credit and offset trading, since most of these credits and offsets rely on some accountability of knowing that that the seller is not selling the same credit to different people. So they have to register these and keep track of them. So we were able to access, these are all made publicly available. And where neither one of those two kinds of data exist, in certain cases we were able to access information based on surveys, past surveys of market participants. We didn't do any surveys ourselves. These were all collection of information from surveys that other folks had done. So what are the public programs we included? Well, a lot, but mostly these came from 4 different agencies: the NRCS, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, and Farm Service Agency. We also got data from about 26 states. We couldn't, not all the states responded to our request for data, but 26 states also provided their information on state level incentive programs for private forest lands. We didn't include, and I'm going to mention this later, but we did not include tax incentives. So compliance markets, the main ones, the main things to know about here are the California Carbon Program is the main compliance carbon market out there in the United States. And then all the water quality things come from the database managed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on these water quality credit trading programs. And the thing to know about these two is that those only tracked the number of credits being traded. So we had to find separate information on the actual price, which came from Ecosystem Marketplace's survey that they do of various markets. And it's a little bit more sparse, that data. So we had to do a little bit more estimating and interpolation there to be able to really create a matrix of prices by state and by year. For voluntary carbon, we have these 3 main public registries. We looked at those, made sure that we were not double counting anything. And then for the biodiversity, this is a big one, the hunting and wildlife viewing payments for access to land, such as hunting leases, came from a survey done by the U.S. Census Bureau and Fish and Wildlife Service. It's done every 5 years. So we got those survey-based estimates and then interpolated for the years in between. And conservation easements from the Trust for Public Land. So as you've been inferring probably from what I've been saying already, we had to do a lot of, so for some of the administrative data, it's like full and complete data. For some of the other data sources, we have to estimate and interpolate a little bit if it's not full over the whole time period and over all the states we're looking at. But even with the public administrative data, sometimes these programs are broad and they don't include only forests and forestry. So we had to do the best we could to filter out anything that's non-forest. So in the case of the NRCS and FSA programs, they have these conservation practices, so you can tell which ones more or less are forest and tree related. So we're able to have them filter the data to only include the forestry related things. When that wasn't possible, we had to estimate based on the forest cover, forest as a percentage of total rural land in each state. And yeah, I've gone over this, but at the end, then the final thing we did was convert everything into inflation adjusted dollars. So we've accounted for inflation already, and these are in 2015 dollars. I just wanted to mention before I show you the results that these data, our data and estimates are going to be made publicly available on a Forest Service research data archive so that others can use them. And we have some manuscripts and a brief manuscript and a brief overview that are currently under review, and the second in press, which is the National Report on Sustainable Forests, which is provided to the Montreal process. Okay, so finally, some results. So in the latest year for which we collected data, which is 2019, about $3.5 billion worth of payments to private forest lands for ecosystem services. Of these, the largest share were actually voluntary payments, followed by compliance markets and then public payments. If you look at ecosystem services, the largest are for biodiversity. Now, looking at the voluntary and biodiversity as both being the largest slices, you may have inferred already that the largest single type of payment for ecosystem services that we have in the United States are hunting leases, as you might have noticed from this picture here on the right. But other components of this are growing. So that was for 2019. If you average this over by year over the past decade, from 2010 to 2019, again, you'll see here, this box down at the bottom is for voluntary biodiversity payments. These are mostly hunting leases. Some of the other large categories are compliance, water payments. So these are your wetland mitigation banking, stream mitigation banking, and other forms of water quality trading practices. And so that's about $600 million per year over the course of this decade. Carbon compliance payments, this is the California Cap and Trade Program for forest carbon offsets, averaged out to $170 million a year. But the thing to know there is that for the first half of this decade, it was essentially zero. So those have gone up a lot. And another large portion here are for bundled ecosystem services are your government programs. Most of the government programs, such as the Conservation Reserve Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP, CRP and EQIP, those are the larger ones. They don't necessarily specify, or they just say it's for soil conservation, but they don't really clearly states an environment and ecosystem service. So we kind of classified those as bundled services. And then these voluntary bundled services are largely they are conservation easements. So this is highly volatile too, goes up and down a lot every year, but on average about $200 million a year on conservation easements. So you can see the time trends a little better on this chart. Again, here we're looking at public in blue, compliance in red, and voluntary in purple. And then the green in the back is the total. So you'll see the compliance payments have gone up quite a bit over the past decade. These are both water and carbon compliance markets. The biodiversity markets have been going up as well. Your your voluntary payments. Sorry, that's both biodiversity in terms of hunting leases as well as conservation easements have gone up quite a bit over the past decade, whereas public payments from government agencies have been on the decline in real terms, that is in inflation adjusted terms. Down from about 596 million in 2005, down to about 503 million in 2019. So gone down by almost $100 million in real terms. Now, if you look at the actual budgets on the books, they probably look flat, but inflation eats away at that. So if you look at this by ecosystem service category, some of these kind of parallel since there's a lot of correlation between which type of market or program pays for which types of services, they sort of parallel. You'll see again the biodiversity payments going up. These are your largely, not exclusively, but largely your hunting leases. Your bundled services going down. These are largely government programs plus conservation easements. Your water quality payments going up, but kind of highly volatile. And the carbon payments very low until 2015 when they started taking off. So looking at this spatially, there are some interesting trends. So I'll just point out here on each one of these slides, there's two maps. On the left map, this is the darkness or intensity of the color shows the payments per state for the whole state. Whereas on this right map, they show the payments divided by the acres of private forest land in that state. So I tend to focus more on this, like where is each acre of forest getting more money? Because a lot of this, the differences in states on the leftmost map is controlled for by just states that don't have much forest land to begin with. So the Great Plains states have very little forest land, so they don't get much money. Nevada has very little forest land, but if you look at a per acre of forest land, the acres of forest land that do exist in Nevada are getting paid reasonably well. When you look at this map, it's hard to figure out what the trends are. So what I did was break these down by ecosystem service category to get a better understanding of where the payments are going to and why. And each one has a very different story. So I'll just point out here that just to put this in dollar terms, the average per acre for private forests across the United States is receiving $6.46 per acre of private forest land for ecosystem services. The lowest states are Wyoming and Utah and Alaska are receiving about Wyoming about 62 cents, Utah 74 cents, and Alaska $1.48 per acre per year. The states with the highest per acre revenues per forest acre are Rhode Island, North Dakota, and Florida, for varying reasons, kind of diverse and different reasons why each one of those states has high payments per acre. So we'll get into that here. So first of all, let's look at carbon. So where you look at where the highest carbon payments per acre are, they're Arizona, California. Well, California has they're the state doing the cap and trade program. Alaska, Washington, and West Virginia. When you look at the database, well, Arizona has very small, limited amount of private forest land area to begin with. But they do have a couple very large carbon projects there. The same is true in Alaska. You'll see Alaska shows up really dark on the total payments map. Alaska has two of the largest forest carbon projects in the country, or maybe the two largest. I can't remember, it's maybe two of the top three largest. And Washington also has a very big project. California has a few. West Virginia has a few very big forest carbon projects going on. We look at water quality. The state that jumps out obviously here is Florida. And Florida has a very, let's say, robust and I guess expensive market for wetland mitigation. In fact, the payments were so high per acre, these actually, I think, probably a very conservative estimate. We were pretty scared to use the numbers that showed up as the average prices per acre. We're talking about in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per acre of wetland mitigation. And so we actually went on the conservative end of those, but it's still Florida by far and away the largest wetland mitigation market. And Louisiana also has a big one. Nevada shows up here. They have an active market, but again, they have very little forest land to begin with. So when you divide by that denominator, it makes it stand out more. Okay, so biodiversity payments. States that jump out here are in the Northeast, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. Large urban centers, but also large areas of forest land where people from those urban centers can go and hunt or go bird watching or whatever it is that people do. Seems to be a very vigorous market for hunting leases in those states. And then the bundled services payments are actually pretty interesting. You kind of see two nodes here of high payments in the sort of the Dakotas, Iowa, Illinois here. And then another node sort of in the northeastern states, what I call the Acela corridor. Well, what's going on in the states in the Midwest and Great Plains is, well, first of all, they don't have much forest to begin with, but they're much larger agricultural states than they are forest states. So they're receiving a lot of these CRP and CREP program payments, which are largely oriented towards farmers, even though they the programs that we're looking at, the conservation practices that we're looking at, I should say, are focused on trees and forestry. They're happening on farms, basically. So these states that have a lot of farms, but a little bit of forest are where those show up the most. Now, the states in the Northeast is a very different thing going on. And it's just interesting, you have these two nodes. the states in the Northeast, you have Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts show up pretty high in terms of these bundled payments. And what's going on there, these are conservation easements. You have highly urbanized states, small states with large population, relatively large populations. The few the forest lands that are left are under urbanization pressure. So the costs per acre of conservation easements in these states are quite high, as well as, you know, there being a desire in civil society to try to protect the remaining forest and that open space areas that do exist in those states. So there's a low supply and high demand, I guess we'll say. All right. So just to conclude, and then we'll have some time for questions. There are a wide range of different types of programs, policies, instruments, markets, regulations that are providing payments to private forest landowners for the ecosystem services they provide. But still, a lot of these are underdeveloped. They're not, from what we know of the true societal demand for these services, that forest landowners are still being undercompensated. And a lot of these, there's a lot more demand for, well, the private forest landowners are trying to enroll in programs, not able. And so there's a lot of missing and underdeveloped mechanisms. We also know that, you know, the amount that people are receiving is very disconnected from any measure of the actual quantity of ecosystem services that they're providing or what the value of those ecosystem services truly is. Voluntary markets are actually the largest, despite what you might think. That's not true for water quality or carbon, where compliance markets are much higher, but for biodiversity especially, voluntary markets, particularly for hunting leases, are the largest. Compliance markets for carbon and water have grown a lot over the past decade and are really making a lot of headway and growth. Whereas public payments have decreased. There is a lot of geospatial variation. There's a lot more to dig into with that temporal and geospatial variation than I've looked into myself. And that's part of the reason why we want to post this data publicly and let other researchers and other institutions have at it and see what they can figure out. That's people that are much more intelligent than me. So that's all I have. And I will let some of you more intelligent people ask me some questions, and I'll do the best I can to respond to them.
Thanks, Greg. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Mason. I'm one of the organizers of NESP, and I'll be moderating this Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat, and I'll try to read them off. So the first question is asking about getting hands on the data. So do you have a timeline for that, or a sense of where that will be posted when some of this spatial data will be available?
Yeah, right now the data set, the data archive itself is under review for our Forest Service data archive. And I don't have, let's see, let me get out of this. I can put in the web chat where, let's see, the archive website. I don't have a good sense of how long it will take for them to review it. I'm hoping later, sometime in the fall, that this would be made public, but let me post this web address into the chat which is the website where it will be. I mean, they'll have there's a data catalog here, and you'll be able to search through the data catalog for it. I don't have the actual exact web link yet.
Thanks. Someone asked about whether data for payments for the purpose of forest health related to the risk of wildfire were included in your data set.
They are, to an extent. Most of those, okay, so a lot of the funding for that comes from the Forest Service, supplemented by state budgets. But the Forest Service funds, by and large, are implemented by state agencies. So the best way to get the information on that is from the states. So as I mentioned, we got information from about 26 states. So we don't have a full accounting of those, but they are in there, and they would be under the bundled services programs.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. If you take away the hunting leases, so that biggest sort of chunk of the pie there, are there any other biodiversity markets that are showing up as significant?
Yeah, so the way it's broken down by the Fish and Wildlife Service is they have hunting as one category, and then they have wildlife viewing as another, which is a, I could probably pull up the numbers and tell you, it's much smaller. It's maybe 10% of the hunting market. Don't quote me on that, but more or less. And then the other one that shows up are the Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as NRCS have some wildlife-oriented programs.
Okay, great. And will all of that sort of detail be included in the posted data sets as well? Some of that breakdown?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's broken down. We're actually, okay, so the way that the data are organized, it's a huge Excel file with, like, I want to say about 50 tabs on the bottom. So we have the raw data that exactly as we imported it from whatever, wherever we got it from. It's just pasted in there. Then we have another set of tabs where we do some manipulation of that data to kind of get into a consistent format and do any of the interpolation or estimation we need to do. Then there's some summary tabs. So any of that stuff you'll be able to dig into in the data. So it's not just the summary. We go from the raw data all the way to these summaries like I presented here.
Great. Lots of fun data explorations to be had. Someone asks here, what do you see as the biggest challenge to appropriately compensating landowners?
Well, I mean, there's several. I mean, if you follow the Ronald Coase way of thinking about the world, I mean, one of the biggest challenges is like defining what these property rights are. Who has the rights to pollute or take away pollution, you know, and who has the rights to get paid for that, or who needs to pay the others. So like setting up that legal framework is one of the big challenges, and that's kind of what like these cap and trade markets are trying to do, is kind of set up the legal regulatory framework for who has the rights to pollute and how much, right? So that's one of the biggest challenges, just setting up this legal infrastructure. I mean, then, you know, monitoring it, keeping track and make sure everybody's abiding by their promises, and measuring, you know, how much is truly actually happening on the ground. So there's some really big challenges to be able to fully compensate landowners for what they're actually doing.
Yeah, monitoring, always the sticky bit. You mentioned that this only includes forests, but you also referenced wetlands. So someone was wondering, are forested wetlands like mangroves in Puerto Rico or Florida included in this analysis?
Okay, so Puerto Rico, no, we only did the 50 states. But whenever we were looking at wetlands, we tried to limit it to only forested wetlands. So there may be like here in North Carolina, like cypress swamps and stuff like that. They're not quite mangroves, but yeah. So we're either where we could, we tried to limit it to things that we could see in the data that it said something related to a forest. So we like some of them are by like ecosystem type. So you can say like, okay, this is a forested ecosystem. So we had to go through all those many dozens of different wetland types and figure out which ones were forested or not. Some of the other programs didn't provide that information. So our alternative method, which is much, probably larger error bars on it, is just to go state by state and look at what % of the wetlands in this state are forested wetlands. And so we just divide by that or multiply by that ratio.
Thanks for that clarification. I have a question here about, you mentioned tax incentives were not included. And so someone was asking what types of taxes were not included. Does that include present use or current use value tax programs, some of which are now for conservation or wildlife habitat?
Correct. We did not include any in this work. We have not included any kinds of tax incentives, which might be income tax incentives such as the reforestation deduction or property tax incentives that all 50 states have some sort of program that forest landowners can enroll. They're by and large justified by some type of ecosystem services. This was separate work that I collaborated on with Mike Kilgore at the University of Minnesota, where we looked at the value and justification of these property tax programs state by state. So that's actually a more challenging thing to do to estimate. So we're only able to do that for 1 year. So just for comparison purposes, so here we saw in 2019 $3.5 billion in payments to for this group of direct financial incentives. When you look at the property tax incentives, our estimate for 2014 was 1.6 billion. 2014 for the payments for ecosystem services, direct financial payments was about, so 2019 was 3.5 billion. I think it was about 3 billion in 2014. So it's a little bit more than half, I think. So it's a substantial amount of tax incentives going out, but it's hard to do. You can't get, there's not like administrative data or anything on that. So we had to do like some estimating state by state. We're only able to do that for one year, 2014. I can post the link to that couple of publications as well, if I can find it quickly.
Okay, thank you. We're getting a ton of questions here, so thank you everyone for contributing. And it seems like there's a ton of interest in this data, so that's great. We have another question asking about the biodiversity data and whether it includes funds contributed from private businesses that are subject to habitat conservation plans. So for example, wind farms that have to mitigate impacts to birds and bats.
Can you restate that question?
Yeah, so do the biodiversity payment, does it include funds contributed from private businesses that are subject to habitat conservation plans? So I think they're talking about biodiversity mitigation banking here. So are those payments included?
There are, but only the ones, we would only have the ones that would be tracked by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer. So I'm not confident that we've got, 100% coverage on the kinds of things that are being mentioned by that commenter. There are, biodiversity conservation banking that are included in our data. I could probably should have had that spreadsheet open here. Well, actually, it should be in, let's see.
If there's things that are harder to share, like links and things, this is also related to the last question.
Yeah.
If you send them to me, I can send them out in a follow-up email. So I'll be sharing the recording with everyone who was here today and everyone who registered. So if there's additional links that we want to share, I can share those out if they're not easily accessible now.
Yeah, let me just share this screen real quick. So you'll see here what the commenter is mentioning, compliance markets for biodiversity. Our estimate, which is probably incomplete, is about $50 million a year. So this would be anything that the U.S. Army and Corps of Engineers tracks, and which would probably be anything that's related to the Endangered Species Act, mitigation under the Endangered Species Act. But if there's other policies or regulation going on there, that might not be included.
Okay, great, thank you. Someone's asking about the bundled services category, and they're wondering if there are any resilience credit markets. So they give an example of emerging systems to quantify, commoditize, and trade credits based in forest functions that improve resilience to climate change or fires. Did you come across anything like that? I think this is a very emerging type of payment from what I understand.
Yeah, no, I don't think we have anything like that unless it's accounted by one of the voluntary carbon registries. If it were in either the American, oh gosh, I'm gonna mess up there. There's the CAR, the ACR, and VERA, Climate Action Reserve, American Carbon Registry, and VERA, or Voluntary Carbon Standard. If it's in one of those, we would have captured it. But I can't, if it's like operating outside the framework of those registries, it probably not.
Got it. Thank you. All right, well, we're just about out of time. I think I got through all the questions in the list. I think there were a few things that maybe we can share links to in a follow-up email. So once we get the recording online, we'll send out a link to this recording and then to any resources that were mentioned on here. But thank you so much, Greg. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to all of us.
You're welcome. And I'm about to paste the link to the publication about tax incentives, property tax incentives.
Great, thank you.
Great.
All
Well,
right.
thank you everyone for joining us today. And Greg, thanks so much for the presentation and for creating this database that I think will get lots of use. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming.
Have a good afternoon.